Chapter 4 Among the Milkwoods. At last, I see improvement from tradition. I see growth and promise in industry without diminishing the old ways. I see respect for nature and yet use of it to its fullest designs. I would stay here if I thought I could, and make use of my unwanted talents, perhaps even my mischiefs. But I'm not one for backbreaking labor, and alas, it would be required of me. From the Journal of Findlay ARDIFIR. Their passage to Fairhill was, as expected, not very eventful. Though the wide vistas were beautiful and the river's edge quite smooth, their minds ever lingered on the next day. They passed along the banks, here and there going over rocky outcrops and through narrow spans where cliffs rose up on either side of the river. Fields of wildflowers blossomed to greet them between these points, and the various fields and farms along the way were thick with the good grown of the late-year harvest. The harvesting seemed to begin with their passing, and along the road they passed a few wagons hauling grain to the nearby towns. Had it been a different time of year, they'd have seen many more sif manning the fields, but as the festival was imminent, a great many of the folk who'd normally tend the fields were away. It was a long journey to the bridge, and blessedly the road was smooth and straight along the banks of the ale stream. They made much better time than their first day's journey, where the latter half of a day proved less than sufficient for what was a considerably shorter journey. Still, they were pleased to make good time, and reached the bridge over a 14-hour span, where they took no breaks and ate only once. They ate as they went, and while that proved slightly more irritating for Findlay, who was bobbing up and down on horseback rather than sitting in a wagon, it had been his decision not to stop even once during the daylight hours. After the night before, he was not looking forward to traveling again by night and wanted a good long rest before the more difficult part of their journey reared its head. Swain complained once or twice over how he'd not be getting to bake their fresh bread, and how their crackers were stale and overly toothsome. Findlay ignored him, and knew that the payoff would be well worth the slight struggle and uncomfortable day. He'd have preferred, if it were possible, to spend their saved time more carefully navigating the wool fields, as news of recent raids had reached Elise in the markets, ere her questioning of the locals. The hunters in that region claimed a mastery of beast rather than branch, and used large black and gray wolves to do their awful bidding. Even among the sif there were thieves and miscreants, and never did they prey on the travelers or on the festival each year. It was their pleasure to maim and injure the travelers, stealing their food and watching them struggle horseless and hopeless across the plains. Among the common folk, where usually utter disdain would be held and firm words would be spoken in reproach, no one seemed to mention the hunters. They were almost beyond reproach, except by the very brave or very foolish, and certainly no one would ever tell them to their faces. They had their own traditions, and living in the north by the stormlands and wide hollows of the Elmwood, they kept their secrets close. Their traditions were said to be dark and bloody, rather than in honor of life. They were the grim note in a long and peaceful song of history, and were hard to ignore, but even harder to confront. The ones who played that sour note were belligerent and dangerous, wielding axes and swords and heavy shields where most sif would hold a trowel or a pair of clippers. Findlay and company reached the bridge just as the sun set, and the final 5 miles went very quickly. Far off in the evening they could see the bright lights of the town of Fairhill rising like a watchtower over the wide fields hundreds of feet up, very near to a mountain fortress in appearance, at least from afar. Fairhill was quite unique in all its ways as well, though not so dark as the hunters of the north and not so old and stern as the elders of the Lumwar. Fairhill was often called the Freelands, as they were kind and generous with their wealth, and did not begrudge those who needed to cut a tree for necessity. Their gardeners and herbalists had mastered the mix of their plants, and nursed young, strong forests that threatened to overgrow if they were not pruned and trimmed quite often. On all sides, just at the base of the massive hillock where the town was built, a thick, dense forest ringed the landscape. There grew the milk trees, strange and specially bred tree that could grow 50 feet in a year, and had a strange white sap that was prized in all lands of the sif. If those trees were left to their own devices, they would likely spread like weeds across the wool fields and wildlands, though they didn't live long, even when let alone. This meant that, of all things, Fairhill was famous for its large bonfires and its cordials made of the milk of many trees. These cordials made the sif there live long and kept them strong even into their old age. Unfortunately, their lives were marked as far more dangerous and difficult, as those who could not work were less welcome, and great age typically meant just that. If one could not work the forest and help to clear the trees, they were judged as a senseless addition to the town, a drain on everyone, and were often shunned. The freedom held there lied in doing one's part, and if that was done well, most sif were left alone to do what they willed. Findlay and the others passed through the Milkwood, and through half a mile of thick forest they saw dozens of woodsmen, all felling trees in a manner rarely spied elsewhere on the island. No one begrudged them. In fact, they were among the most honored and respected in Fairhill, where such a task was known to be quite hard and tiresome, and a day's work would stretch from sunrise until dark each day. Wagons and sleds of pale wood were dragged up the road slowly and were loaded onto larger sleds on either side of the steep path. Ropes and chains there were tugged eternally, and on a massive rotating belt of platforms the logs were hoisted up towards the town proper. This device, built over the previous year, had become vital despite its only recent construction. The sheer number of logs that went in and out of Fairhill was so large that they couldn't hope to move them all by hand anymore. The lumber mills and craftsman structures higher on the hill proved busier than any had ever seen them, and as they were passed on the roads that ring the hill in terraces towards the top, everyone seemed occupied to capacity. "It's never been this busy," Findlay noted, and Everett nodded from his seat on the wagon's front. "Nay, but now that the Milkwood's so healthy and wood's in good supply, it's being asked for all over the island. Even in Minhere, where we don't cut down trees at all, people still need good wood for fires and further building houses without harming our own trees." "Seems strange," Swain noted. "Not really, if you think about it. These trees live a few years, maybe, before they rot and become useless, and even in those years they can spawn several hundred to replace them. It'd be just wasteful not to use them while they're healthy, and the milk that comes from them means longer, better life. If we let them run wild, well, we'd have no place to live. In a generation, they'd sweep across the island and would be choked away beneath their canopies." "I suppose. It just seems inconsistent," Swain further noted doubtfully. "We leave long living trees to grow old. These trees, they ne'er grow old, so we let them do their part to help us along. I guess that's the best I can explain it, but we're not wasteful if we can help it. If it were a walnut tree, we'd take the walnuts, but that don't harm the tree. These give us their wood freely, whether they die natural or sprout as tall as a building in a single year." "Makes sense to me to cut down a tree if they can grow back so fast," Findlay defended. "I think I feel more at home here where I tell the whole truth. I like working with trees, but sometimes it's hard to struggle to find good firewood and wait on nature to build a home around you. Dummels are wonderful, with their slow craft and small even after years of rigorously attentive work." Everett glanced awkwardly at Findlay. Never agreed with the traditions of Minhere, but there's troubles as always here as well. They've no good vineyards or verdant fields for brewing and baking. Yeah, the wool fields are wide, but they're still 36 miles north, and they hold to their own as well. It's a matter of community, lad. Loafhold's forests are mostly nut and fruit trees, so they send their supply all over, along with the wine from the vineyards around the South Willow. Minhere has a lot of barley, root veggies, and the like, and we take a lot of grain in the harvest, though there's more on the road. We also have our ale houses, and those are hard-pressed to match, even palely. Alemwar's old, has its roots dug deep, but around their lands there's more gardens of spices than you'll find elsewhere. The wool fields, well, sure, they're dangerous, but they supply most of our wheat and straw and the like. And Fairhill gives us the wood and tar we need to keep the fires and forges burning. And they make medicine, even if they don't grow the herbs themselves. Altogether, it knits into one wide cloth that covers most things, and here and there are breaks in the normal, but things be rare. I think your home is where it is, after all, laddie." Everett seemed defensive almost, as if he prided himself on having Findlay near at hand. Still, Findlay's mind drifted outward from where he knew, and each year served to distance him from those things. His eyes fell ever on the wide world, and increasingly beyond the twin washes, where things untold lied, and beauty was to be beheld that few of his kind had ever seen, even in glancing. They climbed the tall hill, and everywhere bright bonfires burned to light the city. The lanterns that hung on either side of the road were fueled by black sap from a smaller variety of milk tree, the black milk, one that produces no medicine but a hot burning and very dark tar. It proved a useful source of light, and since they grew so fast and made so much of the sap upon their death, they were a bountiful resource. It had been a long ride, and an hour had passed since sunset when they finally reached the Bitter Flask, an alehouse and tavern right near the top of the ring of town, across from the main hall where the mayor resided and did his business. They stabled their horses, though Nim was left free to run off down the hill towards the fields and graze, as it was his liking to do. After feeding the horses and paying the stableman, they gathered inside and ate well. They had wine imported from Lofold, as well as a number of dainties and confections whose ingredients were from all over. In truth, Findlay had never appreciated just how much work went into getting supplies to Fairhill, where they produced little but wood on their own. Their own shipping channels ran along the river, and it was their duty to maintain them. The bridges towards the Lemoir had proved a hard thing to justify repairing with all of their considerable skill, as little came from that way. With only 2 weeks a year dedicated so largely to travel to and from the city, their minds moved elsewhere. But their roads were well kept and even better built. The straight path that had been traveled by the company that day was a Fairhill road, and had easily half the travel time that would be required had it not been built so well. After dining on a large slab of slow-roasted pork and varying confectionaries for dessert, they mustered in their single room with 4 beds and cozied up for a good rest. All slept well save for Findlay, who found his mind buzzing with thoughts long held and refreshed the morning before. His conversation with the old Sif Garibaldi has brought a number of things into question for him, and evermore had introduced the real idea of leaving the island altogether. It seemed like a far-off thought, though he couldn't hide from it. If he tried to erect barriers to hold it back, it burned through them with its passion and allure. After some 2 hours of struggling and rolling in his blankets, he finally fell asleep, and just before his eyes shut for the night, fear bit through him. The very last thought that entered his mind was just how bad the next 2 days would be, and in that he felt the truest and most acidic fear that he'd had in a long while. Never before had he been so forced to tarry in the wool fields, and with that he felt no comfort in experience and no strength in knowledge. For all that he knew, the journey couldn't be made safely by any means with a wagon, and it seemed an easy target for the hunters who would surely be looking for such prey. He woke well before dawn, and there in his blankets he remained for a time, thoughtful and still. Time dragged on, extruded like thin pasta until it seemed that each second was an hour or more. He rose eventually, and while he felt like he'd been tossing and turning for hours, trying desperately to cling to his rest, he'd in fact been quite still, and moreover for no more than 10 short minutes. He felt the bitter seed of doubt buried in his belly, and there grew into a mighty and gnarled tree. It burned with a dark flame, a flame that gave no light and instead seemed to suckle on the brightness of his mind, draining it into a shadow until it was hollow and sad. His heart was aching with worry, and as he looked ahead to the day before him, he wondered if it might just be a day worth remembering, or if it would be so worth forgetting that no one would ask after them should they disappear in the wool fields. His throat burned with the acid from his gut, and deep in his chest the tension burrowed between his ribs. He steadied himself on the corner of his bed and took a few careful steps towards the front of the room. He approached the looking glass in the corner, lighting a candle before he even thought to check the curtains hung around each bed. He glanced in the reflection and there saw that the thick silken drapes shielded his companions from the unsteady light that he'd made. With a sigh, he stared at his own face. He looked somehow older than he'd expected, whether by some stress or wisdom gained in recent days. His face was lined and gaunt, features sharper than he'd ever seen in himself before. His straight, masculine nose gave way to a firmly sculpted face, and what had seemed like plainer features gained more character through his experience. His reddish-gray skin caught the light in a peculiar way, and seeing it in that way, he felt a surge of strange emotion. He realized only in that moment, for the very first time, that he was of the rare Sif among them. His skin, like charred red leather in places, was quite a unique thing in its own right, and matched with his eyes, made for a striking image. It was one that, in afterthought, seemed to place him in older stories where great Sif did great things, long before their exodus and voluntary segregation from the world at large. He couldn't place any particular story in his mind then, but he knew that some of the further ones, going back thousands of years, would tell of the different tribes of Sif when they'd lived among other races. Is it any wonder that I'm judged so? He wondered to himself dreamily. I have the skin of the Eldkin, and I can't deny that some would know as much. How rare a skin like mine, splashed with red when calm and fiery like a charred roast when I'm furious. And here, in my doubts even, I see the splash of silver in my hair and further questions rise in me. Can I speak of Rodwin Silvermane? Can I relate to him in the struggles he bore ere the world was young? Findlay pondered his own thoughts deeply and wondered at length if indeed he could be so distantly related to the old stories, wherein a Sif saved a king of men when his kingdom fell near ruin. But Findlay felt frail and hobbled next to such legends. Who was he? Who was Findlay ARDIFIR next to the kings of the Eldkin who did such deeds that would be remembered for 100 generations or more? There was a dull fire burning in Findlay's chest then, and he tended it gently as it warmed him from within, and brought courage to his tremulous heart. Having rested enough to move ahead with the day, and with a strength unlooked for in that looking-glass, he fled the room in haste, and took with him only what he needed, a satchel of gold coins and silver tokens, along with his canteen. Outside the inn, he turned back and looked over the building that he had resided and slept so uneasily within. It was built more in the fashion of men, a long hut of wooden slats built up in 3 floors like a great ship thrust out from a green hillock. Like a breaching whale, it seemed to him then, and from its very heart he'd found the courage to move forward where he'd awoken with only doubt. He looked through the darkened streets and was surprised to find them buzzing. Even still, men worked hard hauling their lumber across the lanes as people and horses waited for them to pass. The lantern still burned bright, though somehow the early morning seemed 10 shades darker than the night before had been. Even the bright light of the lamps didn't seem to reach the center of the road, and when he reached that spot in darkness, the tender flame in his chest seemed to light his way instead. He marked his place, and from there he went hastily across the lane towards the road at the furthest end of sight. He saw a sign waving, and on it was burned an anvil and a hammer. The Lion's Forge, a place he'd never intended to go but now had need of in his desperation. He entered the small hut, and within he found a brightly burning furnace, and beside it, a wide-set scythe with an apron across his chest and a rounded hammer in his hand. He pounded at a sheet of metal, and before Findlay had the will to move forward and speak, the sheet had been bent into a shape of a breastplate, still rough and uneven though it might have been. Findlay choked back his words and struggled to find his voice again, to speak over the hammering and make himself and his desires known. I'm going through the woe fields, and I need a cuirass, that which can be masked beneath clothes and leather. And a shield, perhaps, if that seems right to you?
Seems right to me, says you. Needs a weapon, a shield, and a stern cuirass, says I.
The blacksmith answered plainly, though his manner was strange. His voice was very thick and harsh, like one stained by shouting and anger, but he still seemed kind somehow. His tone wasn't clumsy, and his words were quite plain, but beneath them great knowledge lay undisturbed. The blacksmith waited for a response, and after a while turned his great wide head to face Findlay. He was bearded and quite old, and on either arm the veins and muscles jutted out from their place. He was likely the strongest scythe that Findlay had ever laid eyes on, and when they connected in sight, the blacksmith smiled.
Ah, a warrior of old you seek to be,
the blacksmith said enigmatically, and Findlay questioned him as to his meaning.
You've the skin of Eldkin, and while they might be long gone, their blood runs deep and strong. Aye, if you're crossing the hunter's fields, you'll need a weapon, like's they have there. A shield? Aye, I think you're right, and a hidden cuirass, that's slick of you. Don't let 'em see your armor, and they'll strike there, more'n likely. I like a scythe who thinks hard and acts slow, but acts well, and in the right time, no less. The blacksmith reached back onto the wall, and from the racks he pulled an uneven cuirass, half-formed and incomplete. He looked at Findlay and seemed to size him up, measuring with his eyes over a few short moments before he smiled wryly and moved aside the work that he'd been doing. He pounded the plate masterfully, and in a short order it had been formed into a breastplate thin but strong, and sized for Findlay by quick measure and judgment. He called Findlay over quickly. All 3 things, that's 6 gold tokens. I know she's a steep toll, but my steel's good, better'n you'll find elsewhere, and it's quick work if you's travelin' today.
Findlay gladly put the 6 gold tokens on the counter, and the blacksmith smiled further.
Give me an hour, and return for final fitting. I'll get you armored and ready, and teach you to mount it neath your clothes so no one'll spy it, not even with the keenest of eyes. As for your weapon, I see there that you've a knife. May I borrow it? So I might try and match its look with that of your sword, unless you's be wantin' for an axe or a club, but then's I'd give you back a token.
No, the sword will do, Findlay said gratefully and handed over the knife, setting it beside the token still in its sheath.
Now, lad, let me warn you. You seem a good fellow, and I'm pleased to arm you, but know that while in Fairhill it's all well and good to carry sword and shield, it's taken badly elsewhere. You seem a threat to peaceful folk, so I bid that you mind where you walk with them in the open. A knife's all well and good on your waist, but unless you're in the Midlands, I'd not bear sword on your back or your hip.
Findlay nodded. He hadn't thought of it, but surely would as he waited around for his purchases. He left the blacksmith, and for a while the ringing of steel and the hiss of the forge rose above the city. The building seemed to scream out with vigor, and tales spun themselves wildly in Findlay's mind with each passing hammer stroke. His patience was unending, and no moment seemed to drag on as he waited. He felt comfortable with the risks of his journey at last, and expected that such a feeling would last as long as he bore such devices of war. After 1 hour, the blacksmith called out and bid Findlay enter again. He did just that, and as he entered, the blacksmith looked at him strangely, a light behind his amber eyes and a splash of yellow in his golden skin.
"I tried my best to match the work of your knife, but alas, I fear I'm not skilled enough to do it. Not if I had a generation of work ahead of me on it. Still, in appearance, it'll match good enough for some, I think."
Findlay considered him for a moment, then spoke softly and with no expectations. "You wouldn't know anything about the knife, would you? It's an heirloom, and I know little of it, save that it does not do much harm, if any."
"They say that the Eldkin bore weapons with strange feelings about them. Say that their arms brought bravery and power to those that gripped the handles. And the blades were special and sharp and feared by all who saw them, save those who fought alongside. Knows I? Nay, can't speak to it, but weren't forged by our kind, that much I knows. And one more thing, there's a word, perhaps a name, like weapons had in the old fashion. It's engraved on the pommel right here."
The blacksmith pointed to the small, curved teardrop at the base of the hilt. Around it, swirling, was an old script etched into the folded metal.
"I can't read it, but an old tongue I judge it to be. This blade is old, and the steel's likely older than the handle. I'd say this hilt's been replaced not one time, but more indeed. Though how many, there's no telling."
The blacksmith finished measuring Findlay, then instructed that he should remove his outer cloak and strip to his underclothes. The old sif turned and pulled a thin set of mail from his forge's side. Findlay put it on, and while he expected it to make a great deal of noise, it was somehow silent as he brushed it against his clothes. Then, Findlay was fitted with a thin plate that hugged close to his chest and dipped down over his midriff, where it covered his center. His ribs on either side were exposed, but his gut seemed to be clad in a mountain bulwark, not to be pierced by any arms that Sif could devise. Finally, a pair of small pauldrons were affixed to his shoulders, and all of the pieces fit perfectly beneath his shirt, not deforming his shape or giving a hint that they were even there. Next, the blacksmith handed him a sturdy targe, a round shield as wide as the breadth of his arm, and domed slightly towards him to cover his hand and shoulder when he bore it. Last, the blacksmith handed him a fine sheath, only just stained to match the color of his knife scabbard. Both were colored almost like a peacock, with vibrant blues and teals fading to red and violet, and all painted in the fashion of feathers. He drew the sword and saw that it was long, and somewhat heavy in his hand. The handle was large enough for both hands, and the blade seemed heavy enough to require it, but with one hand he could still hold and wield it, albeit less comfortably. Their business concluded, the blacksmith bid him farewell, and as Findlay left, he heard a call from behind him.
"You return on your way back, so's I know that you're safe. I like to hear from those whose skin I could save, so don't you go forgetting,"
he said mirthfully, and Findlay smiled at him. For the first time in recent weeks, he waved goodbye as he faced the blacksmith. He did not seem, at that moment at least, to be marked by his grief. Instead, he felt bravery and true heart, where before there had been only sadness and doubt. He mustered his strength into every step, returning to the inn to find that his companions had long since awoken. They were already packed onto the wagon and eagerly awaited Findlay's return. They looked at him, and though they saw some great change, they all smiled warmly. They couldn't spy his armor, nor did they comment at first on his shield and sword, for he'd held them beneath a wrapping of soft cloth and kept them there for a time. They took to the road and gave a toast to the journey ahead, wishing for fortune throughout the most difficult stretch of their journey. They passed down the northmost road of Fairhill, and in the early hours they found far less Sif hard at work. It was the resting hour, where just before sunrise no work was done, and even the hardiest took rest and gathered for a break together. It was a time of community, and by far the best time of day to come or go if one was not locally born and grown. They scarcely saw a soul as they passed silently out of town, but far behind their wagon, Swain glanced to see that they were not quite alone as they'd thought. A few hundred paces back, two figures rode on horseback, their shapes darkened by the shadows about them. His eyes strained to see them, and after a time they appeared to vanish from view as the sun burst over the mountain with splendor and grace. A steady flame scarred the sky, and from it came long fingers of light which grasped amid the trees and buildings, crowning them in gold. Swain covered his eyes from the sudden flood of light. The great cascade had hit him like a tidal wave, all in gold, and had forced him into blindness for a short while. When his eyes returned, getting used to the brightness about them, the figures were gone. He He marked them to Elise, but she waved him off, though disquiet was not lessened by her assertion that they simply turned aside. Elise had not been there to see them, skulking quietly about the camp as they thought he slept, and as Findlay was off gathering wood for the fire. Likewise, Elise had not noticed them on the cliffside, where Swain and Findlay had both marked them silently to themselves. Findlay didn't hear the brief exchange, but had similarly glanced back to see the figures, though his splash of pride and great strength still burned within, and he judged them as less threatening than they had been. After a time, he even called his own dismissal silly and foolish, and wished that he'd paid greater attention to them, for a follower unwanted was a worth worry indeed. At the base of the hill, they looked northward with a pause, and Findlay stared over the seemingly endless miles of fields, stretching beyond sight and into the deep northern mists. Far off and turning eastward, a forest was born amid the edge of golden grass and wild wheat. It rose and fell in places, a wrinkled blanket of deep green, vanishing similarly into deep mist that the morning's daggers of light could not pierce. There was an awful tension in the air as they sat in silence, and the very world's breath seemed weakened and afraid. The wind didn't dance the way it might have had the mood been better, and little gusts only served to drag the dark thoughts nearer. Even as they watched, the clouds in the distance, stretching from the ground all the way to the heavens above, was blasted with white light. The thin structure of luminous roots cut through shadow, and sometime later the crack of thunder reached their awaiting ears. "That bodes ill," said Everett, and his face was grave. "Even for those who put no stock in omens or portents." "Swain, get the water cloaks," Findlay ordered, and Swain obeyed quickly. He gathered 4 thin leather cloaks, all deep black and long enough to cover most of the travelers' bodies. He passed them around, and atop their furs they wrapped themselves in comforting shields against the rain. Swain moved to pull on a pair of cords, and overtop the wagon, a long cover unfurled, covering the front and back in a sort of curtain where they had once been open. A small canopy likewise extended overtop Everett, protecting him further from the heavy rain that they now expected. Findlay was left to guide them from the front, exposed to the elements but ready to embrace them. Beneath him, Nim stamped, and his eyes seemed thoughtful and considerate of the road ahead. About them were still many milk trees, though they were sparse on the north side, and many had been felled the night before. Stumps decorated the ground about them, and their view forward was clear of obstruction. After a long wait, Swain handed out rations for the road.
"I don't expect we'll be stopping for a while, so keep your food dry and keep your strength up. Everyone's filled their water, right?"
Everyone nodded, and Findlay lifted his canteen in affirmation. Unbeknownst to the others, Findlay had gathered a small case of varying cordials on his walk back from the blacksmith, all in differently colored glass bottles. One he'd already drained into his canteen, a bottle slashed with bright gold lines over milky white glass. The Planeswalker draft, it was called, and was rare, even in Fairhill. It had cost him more than a week's worth of food for only an ounce, but it would delay his need for sleep beyond the span of his will. With it mixed through his water, he might not feel the weight of sleep on his eyes for 2 days or more, and that would be enough to serve him through the harsh road that they looked towards. He was quite prepared, more so than any of his companions guessed, and more still than he'd expected to be only 1 day earlier. He was present in the moment, and his mind was firm and strong. With a rearing of his mount, he started forward at a fair pace, and the wagon struggled behind him to keep up. Pityingly, Nim slowed to allow them to bridge the distance, but the fire that burned in Findlay's chest seemed to leap into his mount as well, and drove him hard to keep moving. The clouds gathered about them in short order, and in less than an hour they were strangled by the deep fog, and only their lanterns gave sight between them. Even from 20 paces apart, Findlay could only see the soft glow of a waving lantern, doddering back and forth as they pushed forward. He glanced back every few seconds to ensure that it was still nearby, and was comforted each time he saw the bright glow of burning black milk tar through the fog. They proceeded for a while in that fashion, and every 10 minutes or so they grew too far apart to see each other, and Findlay was forced to pause and wait up. It was during one such time, when Findlay had ridden harder than he'd meant to, that he waited for his companions to catch him up on the wide road. The lights flickered, and for a moment seemed to raise up slowly before quickly descending again and trembling subtly in the foggy shadows. At once it burst towards him, and in a moment of surprise, Findlay might have been thrown aside from his saddle, but his great steed reacted for him and dove aside gracefully. The wagon overtook him, barreling past with all the speed that 2 draft horses could muster. It wasn't too much, but the weight of the wagon would have served as a battering ram through a crowd of unwary people, throwing dozens aside before showing any sign of slowing. "Wolves!" Swain's voice cried, but it was somewhat strangled in the mist and felt far away, even as it had passed only a few feet from Findlay. As Findlay started after the wagon, watching as it rolled and rattled over the uneven road, then off it, then back again over small rocks, he saw that Swain was huddled against the side. Elise, as she came into view, looked grave but stern, and the face of a fighter had replaced her beautiful gold and gray visage. She was almost scowling, but her face was as stone, resolute and powerful with intention. She grabbed for the sword that she'd bought in the market, but didn't unsheath it, lest she cut a hand off while the wagon jostled so fiercely. As her eyes met with Findlay's, and bright crimson struck through the mist to meet cobalt, a blaze connected them, and understanding was gained without word or gesture. Findlay unfurled his wrappings and mounted his great steel and milkwood shield over his left arm. He bore a mighty sword for a scythe, the length of a longsword for men, but of a 1.5-hander for their stature. He swept the long, curved edge down beside Nim's galloping legs, and through the mist it carved, sending small spirals across the ground from its cleaving the air. He didn't remove his cloak to reveal the armor beneath it, but the bright shimmer of his ring mail peeked out from beneath his shirt, and Elise was the only one to see it. For her part, for the first time, she judged him as a knight of the Sif, a thing that hadn't existed for nigh on 2,000 years. Not since Marcos Donnell, the guardsman of the Song Willow, had one been clad so great and so secretly. There were openly armored Sif, of course, but it was their prerogative to afflict attempts to their lives with the shine and shimmer of their armor. It was a show of force, and not a practical armament. Likely, most guardsmen would despise the idea of a fight, and would avoid it at all costs. They would bear weapons that they couldn't truly wield. They would wear armor so heavy they could barely walk, and their image was more frightening by far than their actual threat could ever match with strength or resolve. Findlay seemed different. A blue and violet flame burned brightly in his eyes, and they were intent on protecting those he loved. There was a chill in his face, though not for him, but for anyone who looked upon it. Elise thought to herself, quite silently, that he looked like one of the North Wind, one of the elders from the far lands who swore that the cold winds would mount the world and would cast it down into never-ending winter. Those old ones, who had been so tall and so fair, had grown bitterly cold, and their strength matched their frosted hearts. To even look at them was said to rip a heart to pieces, and to leave one ever in despair, if they were at odds with the old one. Elise felt that chill, even as the blue flame burned, but she was not at odds with him, and was so heartened by his strength and aura. Findlay nodded to her, and she took his meaning well. She unsheathed her blade and held it firmly in her grip, and she waited the closed back of the wagon as the leather cover flapped and cracked from the heavy wind all around. Shadows clambered towards the back of the wagon, but just as they grew near, and the bite of fear gnawed deeply into Swain, Elise saw that they were moving too quickly to stop, and their aim was to either side of the road. They wound around the wagon wildly, and there they passed it, and moved on towards Findlay. And the wagon seemed safe, somehow.